Okay, now we can get started. We'll be in the book of Esther this morning, and probably about a 12-week series, because we'll take a Sunday off for Mother's Day and baby dedication on the same day, and then Father's Day. So what I'm going to try to do is hit one chapter a week, and I trust that you will. That the Lord will speak to all of our hearts. I think I last did this series back in 2019, I think. So if you remember if you remember the first sermon, you're free to leave. Okay? I wouldn't remember it if it was yesterday. But I think I've done it since 2019. Maybe not. She can't find Esther. 2019, okay. Y'all don't remember it, so. Yep. Okay, see you. All right, Esther chapter 1 is where we'll be this morning. November. All right, hang on just a second. I need to find one thing. All right. Here we go. When you think, and you're like me, you don't think about this, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. Most of our days begin just like any ordinary day. For most of us, for the most part. But in any ordinary day, something extraordinary can occur that can not only change the course of one day, it can change the course of an entire life. And let me give you two extremes. One extreme is experiencing the birth of a baby. Got one back here. The other extreme is experiencing a death of somebody that's really close to you. Those are the two extremes. And while life will go on, and we manage through those things, especially on the death end, on the life end of a baby, not only does your entire life change, so does your bank account. It goes way south. But you navigate and you go on through life. You deal with all the financial issues of having a baby that you think you never could. You deal with deaths that you thought you never would. But we navigate through those things. But in all of those things that's happened in our lives, you think how that day started out just an ordinary day. And then all of a sudden it changes. The same thing in biblical examples. Let me give you some of these. The morning when the flood started, how long did it rain? 40 days, 40 nights. Started out as an ordinary day, just a rain shower. But you see what it turned into. The morning when Moses encountered the burning bush, he had killed an Egyptian. At age 40, he was on the backside of the desert with his uncle's sheep, thought his life was done. And at age 80, he sees a bush burning. He walks up to it and his life's forever changed. He leads children of Israel out of Egypt. David is tending sheep. Samuel shows up and goes through all of Jesse's sons. He said, is there anybody else? You got any daughters? I'm looking for somebody. Well, I got one other son, but he's not much count for. Go bring him in. And guess what? The new king of it started as an ordinary day for him. The day Jesus arrived on the scene, when he was born, just an ordinary day. And by the end of that day, the world will never be the same. At Jesus' resurrection, when they're going to the tomb that's already empty early that morning, it was just another ordinary morning. Nobody expected what was about to happen. They said they did. They some believed, some didn't, but the tomb was empty. All those are things we've dealt with in the past, but get this one. And this one hasn't happened yet. But you think about the day when Jesus comes back. We don't know when that is. Let's say it's on a Monday in September. Guess what our kids will get up and start getting ready to do? Just like in the morning. They'll get up and head to school. We'll get them to school. We'll head to work. We will do the things that we normally do, but then in the twinkling of an eye, Jesus will return. And it'll begin as any other ordinary day. But when that happens, God's plan for the future will take center stage. Now, all that being said, that was a long introduction. This is what happens in the story of Esther. You have, and we'll be introduced to her in chapter 2, but we have an unknown orphaned young girl who has zero connection with the most powerful man in the Persian Empire, the king. And when you start Esther chapter 1, God begins to weave these two lives toward each other. Neither one of them have a clue right now, but it's just an ordinary day, just like you and I are experiencing. Let me share one other thing and then we'll get into the lesson itself. 4, you can call them facts or truths or whatever, but 4 things that make this such a dynamic book. Number 1, it's named after a woman. What's the only other Old Testament book named after a woman? The book of Ruth. Esther is never quoted from in the New Testament. Never. Number 3, prayer is never mentioned. You think, it can't be in the Bible then. Prayer is never mentioned in the book of Esther. And those are not the most astounding facts. Here it is. The name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not even a pronoun reference to His name. Nowhere in the book of Esther. But from chapter 1 to the last chapter, He's on every single page in the story. And that's the book of Esther. That's why it's such an amazing book. 2 reasons why Esther is important, and I think I have these to put up for you. Number 1, it shows how God delivered the Jews. You know, and I'll probably get in trouble for putting this on. You almost want to laugh when you hear Iran thinks they can destroy Israel. Ain't going to happen. You know why? This book. Israel has the one thing, the only thing that they need to defeat any army. And it's not its army. It's God. That's all we got to know. Some preacher one day said, Israel has been the pallbearers to every nation that's tried to wipe it out. They've got God, so they've got more than enough. But the Bible itself is the story of how God delivers us. Esther is one of those stories. It tells how the Jews were saved because one man got sideways with Mordecai. And he thought he had a plan to wipe them out. And for a while that plan seemed to be able to be put in place to work. But it didn't. The second reason Esther is important, and we'll look at this as we get to it toward the end of the book, is called the Feast of Purim, Purim. And it's a feast that's celebrated by the Jews to remember what God did and Haman couldn't do. And that was deliver his people. And listen, let me tell you something. We ought to celebrate that every day. God has delivered us, and we ought to live every day in remembrance of that. We do the Lord's Supper occasionally, but every day of our life should serve as a remembrance of what God has done and is doing for us. The purpose of Esther. I want to give it to you in one verse, and then we'll look at chapter 1 to see how we finally get to Esther. But the key verse in Esther is chapter 4 and verse 14. It's up here on the board. Look at it. Mordecai is telling Esther this. He's told her the plan. He's told her what Haman's about to do. And he's told Esther, here's a word from the Lord for you, Esther. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. You know what that tells me? Let me stop right there and say this. When we don't do what God's called us to do, there's always a next man up. I promise you, if I told God today, I'm not preaching anymore, I'm done, He'll laugh and He'll say, there will be another man up there next Sunday, I promise you. The world doesn't stop because you've decided to bail. So that's what He's telling Esther. And you and your father's house will perish, okay? And who knows whether you, Esther, have not reached royalty for such a time as this. In other words, Mordecai is saying, Esther, all this that God has weaved together with a man you didn't even know. And surely even if you knew him, you couldn't get in his presence. But God's put you here for that. Let me tell you something, guys. Where you're sitting this morning, God's put you here today, this morning, for such a time as this. And He's put you in this life where you are, things that's going on for such a time as this. He's got a purpose for your life. He's got a purpose for all the little ones in here. He's got a purpose for all the big ones and old ones in here. He's got a purpose. And that's the message that Mordecai is giving her. All right, this is probably the only sermon I'm going to do it, but I'm going to read through all these verses, okay, so you'll know when we're about done, and I'll hurry. I just want to walk you through the story and how it begins this morning. Esther chapter 1 and verse 1. Now it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. What did we talk about at the beginning of the message? Just an ordinary day. This is how this day begins out. It's just an ordinary day. Verses 2 through 4. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he held a feast for all his princes and servants, the military officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces, being in his presence. Verse 4. While he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Now some Bible commentators say it wasn't just a straight 180 days, but the purpose of this was to discuss going to war with the Greeks. That's what it was about. Verses 5 through 8. See, this wasn't going to take as long as you thought. And when these days were fulfilled, the king held a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and blue linen, held by cords of fine purple linen, on silver rings, and marble pillars, and couches of gold and silver, on a mosaic pavement, porphyry, that's rock, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Verse 7. And drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's hand. And the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. For so the king had established it for each official of his household, that he should do according to what pleased each person. The last part of that verse kind of sounds like Judges 21:25. There were no kings in that day, so people kind of did what they wanted to do. It didn't make any difference. And basically, what verses 5 through 8 are telling us is this. There was a 7-day banquet for everybody in the king's garden. Drink whatever you want and as much as you want. Listen, that's the society we live in today. But just get wasted. Do whatever. The king gave permission for everybody to do that. But in verses 9 through 11 comes a pivotal moment. Verse 9. Queen Vashti, who is the queen up to this point, also held a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he said, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended to the presence of King Ahasuerus. Verse 11. Here's what King Ahasuerus wants to do. Bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful in appearance. Vashti's holding her own party. Now, King Ahasuerus and all the people in his party, having had way too much to drink, call for Vashti. He wants her to come with her party and show herself off. That's the king's request that he's sending to the queen. Verses 12 through 15. This is where the story takes a turn. Vashti gets word. But Queen Vashti did what? She refused to come at the word of the king. Listen, I don't know what kind of life she lived, but right here she's more moral than the king. She's not going. At the word of the king, which was delivered by the hand of the eunuchs, then the king became exceedingly furious, and his wrath burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for it was the custom of the king thus to speak before all who knew law and justice, and were close to him, Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti? Because she did not do the declaration of King Ahasuerus delivered by the hand of the eunuchs. She's not coming, king. She's just given us word. She's not coming at your request. What are we going to do? What's the next step? Again, keep in mind, guys, God has got the new queen waiting in the wings. And, I mean, we see what they don't see. We know what's about to happen. They have no clue. But watch as we begin to weave this story together in a most dynamic, only God can do way to bring deliverance. So that tells us whatever we're in, whatever circumstance, God may not deliver the way you want Him to, but God will deliver. Verses 16 through the end of the chapter, and then I want to share some thoughts with you. Then in the presence of king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has committed iniquity against not only the king, but also against all the princes and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the word about the queen will get out to all the women, causing them to despise their husbands in the eyes by saying, King Ahasuerus said for Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of this word about the queen will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of spite and indignation. If it seems good to the king, let a royal word go forth from him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be replaced. And here it is, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And who might that be? Esther. And the king's sentence which he will make will be heard throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, and all women will give respect to their husbands, great and small. And this word was good in the eyes of the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, to every people according to their tongue, to every man should be the ruler of his own house, and the one who speaks in the tongue of his own people. So what happens here is Queen Vashti is about to walk through the exits, and Queen Esther is about to enter. Again, Esther knows nothing of the law. She knows nothing of what's transpiring in the meeting. She knows absolutely none of this. And then and I encourage you to read chapter 2 next week, we'll begin to see God weave a little tighter. But let me give you some practical points to what we've read. Number one, God is present even when we do not recognize His presence. Let me ask you again. Does King Ahasuerus have any idea what's about to happen? Number one, he has no idea that Vashti's not coming. He just assumes she'll be here in 5 minutes. Then when he gets word she's not coming, then all the men come to the king and say, all of us husbands are in deep trouble. You better sign a law that keeps us the man of the house. So he does. And in doing so, it sends Vashti out. And in chapter 2, they begin this system that, and listen, God's already handpicked the winner to bring Esther in. And nobody knows this is going on. But listen, I told you, God's name's not mentioned, prayer's not mentioned. You know, nobody went to the king and said, hey, let's pray about what we need to do. That wasn't even on the table. But prayer and God's all through this story. That's what makes this story the story that it is. God is present even when we don't recognize it. You think about tomorrow now when you get up and go to work. How much in the 24-hour day tomorrow will I recognize God's presence? Not many. We will if something happens, because then we'll cry out to Him. But in the ordinary day tomorrow, as you're driving to work, as you're working, as you're eating lunch, as you're going home, as you're watching TV tomorrow night, how many times will we recognize the presence of God that lives inside of me at this moment? He's in every second of my life. And very few times do I recognize His presence. Number 2, God uses the saved and lost to accomplish His will. See, God has a plan. God has a will. And when you look at this story in Esther, it starts out with a bunch of wicked people to begin with. When God spared Israel, when he brought them out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses, He used Pharaoh. Nobody is outside of the reach of God using in His plan, saved and lost alike. And that's what this story's filled with. I mean, if God were not able to use the lost in this story, there'd be no Esther story. But He uses the saved. He uses the lost. I've told you before, my dad preached for how long? I don't know. Lost. And God used his preaching as a lost man to convict him of his own preaching and his need for Jesus. He uses the saved and lost alike. Number 3, God always has a purpose in what he allows or causes. And you see a mixture of that in this story. What God allows to happen and what God causes to happen. He can do that because he's sovereign. He's in control of it all. He wrote the script. He narrates it. He runs it as he does in Esther. 2 verses. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, which everybody knows. And we know that God works all things for good together for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. The key to that verse, and we sometimes forget this, God does cause all things to work together. He doesn't cause all things, and all things are not good, but he does cause all things to work together for good. But the key to this verse is the last part of that verse. Those who are the called according to his purpose. That's not a verse for lost people. That's a verse for God's people. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6. Paul says, "For I am confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Jesus Christ." Part of this story, God's ultimate plan for Esther, the book of Esther, was to save his people. That was it. God's whole plan for mankind that's recorded in Scripture was for God to do what? Save his people through Jesus. And so as this story begins, in a most unusual way, a king throwing a party, and God takes this wicked party, that's the beginning of God saving his people. None of us would have written that script, but that's what the story of Esther is about. And it's amazing, and I trust you'll be able to endure through the book of Esther, but how this thing takes twists and turns, and how at the very last minute you think they have zero chance. And they do have zero chance. But God. God is the determining factor for his people. They will always try to wipe out Israel. They will always try to make Israel non-existent anymore. But as long as God is God, that'll never happen. Trust you'll read chapter 2 for next week, and we'll get into how Esther finally gets word to what's going on. But listen, even in that, she has no clue what she's being picked for and how God will use Esther. Friend, Esther 4:14 is a verse for you and me. God has put you here for such a time as this. Father, thank you for this wonderful book. And Lord, thank you for the truths that it contains. And thank you that while prayer and the name of God is never once mentioned, it's seen on every page, every chapter, every verse in this book. And Lord, the ultimate plan is for you to save your people. And that's why you gave Jesus. When it seemed no way out, when Adam and Eve failed you in the garden and that sin nature was passed on to every person that would ever be born, you already had a plan set that Jesus would come and die on a cross and bear the sins of the whole world. Lord, my prayer this morning is this: if there is one person under the sound of my voice who's never given their life to Jesus, Lord, I pray for strength to do that this morning. Father, as we began this message just by talking about ordinary days, how they begin, how this ordinary day has begun, this could be the day Jesus comes back. Lord, I pray if there's one in our midst who's never given their life to you, that this would be that moment for them. Not to come join this church, not for any other reason than to be spared the torments of hell. Just as Esther was chosen, Jesus was chosen. Jesus paid for my sins, paid for your sins. For those who want to just come and kneel and pray, you take this time of invitation this morning, Father. You be glorified and honored in Jesus' name.